rain lashing against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance. I had just settled down with a cup of tea, enjoying the cozy warmth of my living room, when the lights flickered and went out. The house was plunged into darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning. I sighed and reached for the flashlight I kept on the coffee table. As I clicked it on, a sudden knock at the door made me jump. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not in this weather. Cautiously, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. 3 figures stood on my porch, barely visible through the rain. They were tall and motionless, their faces obscured by the darkness. I hesitated, a sense of unease creeping over me. Something about them felt off. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice wavering. There was no answer. The silence was unnerving. I decided not to open the door and backed away slowly, my mind racing. Suddenly, I heard a window shatter in the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat as I realized the figures were no longer on the porch. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, and crept towards the kitchen. The flashlight beam revealed broken glass and rain pouring in, but the figures were nowhere to be seen. I felt a cold draft, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned to leave, and there they were, standing in the hallway. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and their presence filled the air with a palpable sense of dread. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. They remained silent, their eyes fixed on me. Panic surged through me as I realized I needed to get out of there. I bolted for the back door, but one of the figures was already there, blocking my escape. I turned and ran upstairs, my only thought being to get away. I slammed the bedroom door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. I frantically looked around for a way out and spotted the window. It was a long drop to the ground, but I had no choice. I climbed out onto the ledge, the rain soaking me instantly. I edged along the narrow ledge, trying to reach the tree near the corner of the house. Just as I was about to make the jump, the window shattered behind me. One of the figures reached out, its long fingers grazing my shoulder. With a desperate cry, I leapt for the tree. I caught a branch and clung to it, my heart pounding. I scrambled down, nearly slipping on the wet bark, and hit the ground running. I didn't stop until I reached my neighbor's house. I pounded on their door, breathless and soaked to the bone. Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins opened the door, their eyes wide with concern. "What happened?" Mr. Jenkins asked, ushering me inside. "Someone broke into my house," I gasped. "I don't know who they are, but they're still there. We called the police, but by the time they arrived, the figures were gone. The officers found no trace of them, just the broken windows and the rain-soaked floors. They assured me they would patrol the area, but it did little to ease my fear. I spent the next few nights at the Jenkins house, too afraid to go back home. Eventually, I moved to a different town, hoping to leave the terror behind. But every time it rains, I remember those silent.
The rain poured down in relentless sheets, drumming against the roof and windows. I love stormy nights, the way they wrap the world in a blanket of sound. That night, I was enjoying a cup of tea when my phone buzzed with a message from my new neighbors, Emily and Chris. They were newlyweds who had moved in a month ago, and we had exchanged pleasantries a few times. "Can you come over? We need your help," the message read. Curious and slightly concerned, I grabbed my umbrella and headed next door. Emily greeted me at the door, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice shaking. "We've been experiencing strange things." "What kind of things?" I asked, stepping inside. The house was eerily dark, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning. "Chris found an old mirror in the attic," Emily explained, leading me to the living room. "Ever since we brought it downstairs, strange things have been happening." I glanced at Chris, who was sitting on the couch, staring at the large, ornate mirror propped against the wall. His expression was distant, almost vacant. "We need to get rid of it," Emily continued, her voice trembling. "But every time we try, something stops us." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" "Watch," Chris said, his voice hollow. He stood and grabbed the mirror, attempting to lift it. As he did, a loud crash echoed through the house, and the lights flickered. Chris dropped the mirror, his face contorted with fear. "We think it's cursed," Emily whispered. "We don't know what to do." I approached the mirror cautiously, feeling an inexplicable pull towards it. The surface was dark and seemed to ripple like water. As I stared into it, I saw something move, a shadowy figure, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "We need to destroy it," I said, backing away. "It's the only way." Chris nodded, his face set with determination. He grabbed a hammer from the garage and handed it to me. I hesitated, then swung the hammer at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, sending shards flying across the room. For a moment, everything was still. Then the lights flickered again, and a cold wind swept through the house. The shadowy figure from the mirror emerged, its form twisting and writhing. Emily screamed, and Chris grabbed my arm, pulling me towards the door. "Run!" he shouted. We bolted out into the rain, not stopping until we reached my house. We locked the doors and windows, huddling together as the storm raged outside. The next day, we returned to their house. The mirror was gone, and there was no sign of the shadowy figure. We searched the attic and the entire house, but everything seemed normal, if a bit eerie. Emily and Chris decided to move out soon after that night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I helped them pack, glad to see them leave that cursed house behind. To this day, I can't explain what happened that rainy night. But every time I hear the sound of rain against my window, I remember the dark mirror and the terror it unleashed. I've learned to stay away from old, forgotten things, especially those that
the kind where the rain seemed to fall sideways, and the wind howled like a pack of wolves. I was home alone, enjoying a quiet evening with a good book and a cup of tea. The power had flickered a few times but had mercifully stayed on. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house, making me jump. I thought it might be the wind knocking something over outside, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on my porch. My heart started to race. I lived in a quiet neighborhood where unexpected visitors were rare, especially in this weather. I crept towards the front door, trying to peer through the peephole. A flash of lightning illuminated the porch, and I saw him, a tall man wearing a mask. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering my situation to the operator. She told me to stay calm and that officers were on their way. I backed away from the door, trying to think of a place to hide. As I did, I heard the sound of glass shattering. The intruder had broken a window and was climbing into my house. I ran to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife I could find, my hands shaking. The footsteps were getting closer. I hid in the pantry, clutching the knife, my breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps. I could hear him moving through the house, his footsteps deliberate and heavy. The storm outside raged on, but inside, it was eerily silent except for the intruder's movements. Suddenly, the pantry door swung open, and there he was, his masked face staring down at me. I screamed and lashed out with the knife, grazing his arm. He cursed and lunged at me, knocking the knife from my hand. I scrambled to my feet and bolted out of the pantry, slipping on the wet floor but managing to stay upright. I ran towards the back door, the sound of his pursuit close behind. I fumbled with the lock, my hands slick with sweat and rainwater. Just as I got the door open, he grabbed my arm, yanking me back into the house. I twisted and kicked, managing to break free, and dashed out into the storm. The rain was blinding, but I didn't stop. I ran through my yard, slipping and stumbling, until I reached my neighbor's house. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. Mr. and Mrs. Williams, my elderly neighbors, opened the door, their faces etched with concern. "What's happening?" Mr. Williams asked, pulling me inside. "Someone broke into my house," I gasped. "He's after me." Just then, we heard the wail of police sirens. The intruder, seeing the approaching lights, fled into the night. The officers arrived moments later, taking my statement and searching my house, but the man with the mask had vanished without a trace. That night left me shaken to my core. I couldn't sleep, haunted by the memory of that masked face and the terror I felt. The police increased patrols in the area, and I installed a state-of-the-art security system, but the fear lingered. Every time it rained, I was transported back to that stormy night, to the sound of footsteps and the sight of the masked intruder. I had narrowly escaped with my life, but the psychological scars remained, a constant reminder of the night my sanctuary was violated and my